there's lots and lots of things you need to consider. It's not an easy question at all, because it partly depends entirely on what you're doing, and partly will depend on why you're doing that, and what you're trying to do with that, who you're working with, for instance. I think probably the main thing to really think about is consent, in terms of making sure that you're very, very clear. If you're working with people, which social scientists often tend to, that you're very, very clear about what it is you're trying to do, why, where the information they give you will be presented, how it will be presented, whether they will be identifiable or not, and all these questions. And there's no easy answer to that. They're always different. They're always the same questions, but there's always different answers to those questions whenever you ask, whatever your project is. I think the key is being clear and giving them a clear way to withdraw if they want to.
I think with ethics, people tend to think about ethics as something to do with an ethics committee or an ethics review board. So you want to do a piece of research, and somewhere down the line you have to get some sort of an approval. And people don't tend to think about the ethics bit until they get to that point of asking for approval, whereas actually you need to be thinking about it right from the start. So the ethical issues to think about are about you as a researcher. Are there any needs you have about being looked after or being kept safe? And also about your own skills and your own abilities, the time frame that Haseeb mentioned earlier, that if you are not going to overstretch yourself, that you're not going to take on things that might cause harm to you or others. So that you start with you. And then as you're doing your literature search and you're thinking about your question, again, ethics is in the back of your mind. So who am I going to be studying? What am I going to be asking them to do? What have other people done before? How have they got ethics approval, and what has happened with them? When you're reading papers, we tend to read papers to see, do they help us stack up our argument, rather than what was the whole piece of research done there? So you can often spot when you read other people's papers that perhaps there were questions about ethics that you don't feel really were fully answered, or perhaps were explained very well. So again, look and see, did the paper make you feel reassured? Imagine actually you're not a researcher, but a participant. Would that research have actually made you feel safe and included? And was it a consensual process or not? And then when you're thinking about your own research, building in piloting, building in checking, building in testing, talking to people who are going to be like the participants in your study or the communities you'll be working with, and making sure that you are the right person to be asking the questions, that the questions that you want to ask are appropriate. If they've been answered before, do you need to ask them again? If you are going to answer them, how are you going to ask them in ways that don't put your participants not just in a stressful or dangerous situation or an uncomfortable situation, but do you include them? Do you make your research accessible? Do you inconvenience them? That's come up a lot in the conversations we've been having about participants are expected to kind of get to you as a researcher, but maybe they're having to pay transport costs to do that. How are you even thinking about budgeting in your research so that people aren't inconvenienced in any way? So there's lots and lots of ethical questions actually that you would be asking all the way along, and having a thought about them then helps you put together your ethics application. Bearing in mind that this isn't like a rubber stamp that once you've got that you are a good researcher and free to go. It's just a step in the proceeding along with your supervisor or your research team or other bodies you're working with of oversight that the work's being done, but ultimately it's you, the researcher, who's the person who's got to be the ethical one. So you can have ethical approval and still do unethical research. It's just a case of thinking all the way through. So I guess it's an encouragement to see it as it's a thread that runs through everything. It's not just something you drop in here and there.
This goes back to a trick that I do all the time, and I've really encouraged young scholars to do it again and again. And that is to piggyback on what's already been done, but maybe not in your country or context. So if you find a very fine study, but it was only done with, white Americans or Pakistani people from England or whatever, you have these really different populations, and you say, but this could be possibly replicated in my country or not, or I think my country would be an exception. They've already passed a lot of the hurdles that you would need to pass. And so what you could really do is just frame it up. I always talk to the scholar first. I don't steal other people's research, but I do the more elegant version of stealing, which is to team up with them and to ask them if they would mentor. And then, of course, sometimes they'll even co-author. And then you could simply extend the study to your country. Often you'll find that it doesn't work in a different context. I've rarely found something that works for one group and just works beautifully for another. Sometimes. We have a woman doing that now. She lives in Korea, and she is looking at single parenting there, but it's really different in her country than it is in a lot of the contexts of the literature that she's working with. So she, by definition, has all these new questions to ask simply because she lives in Korea. And, you know, she's highly supported by the scholars who did the research because they can't go to Korea. They don't have the funding and they don't have the cultural context. So she becomes an essential correspondent for their thing. And when I was listening to Petra really give that great list of all these ethical things to think about, well, good, they've already thought about them. And some big universities already signed off. So it doesn't mean you can just go then. You still have to get a sign off. But I think a university would feel much more comfortable signing off if they knew that the highly recognized university of such and such had already been okay with this. I don't know. So that's one too, where the shoulders of giants. Who said that? Was that Hesse? Yeah, thank you. Because it's don't let go to waste the incredible strength of these people. They often want to partner with you because it makes them more global, and frankly, you're free for them. They otherwise would have to go to your country and figure out what's going on. And now you're just standing there saying, hello, I live here. I speak the language. I have a PhD. What's not to love? You know, I know someone will team with you. It might not be the first person you ask, but I know someone will team with you, because who could resist?